I want to tell you about the most feared man in this city. And the 9-year-old boy who destroyed him in 3 days. Not with a weapon. Not with words, really. Just a prayer. A small, shaking, completely sincere prayer that this man hadn't heard since he was a child himself. Since before the world showed him what it actually was. Here's what you need to understand about him before we go any further. He didn't become cold because he wanted to. He didn't build walls because it was comfortable. He built them because the alternative was feeling everything that happened to him on one Sunday morning when he was 12 years old. And that was not survivable. Not for a child. Not alone. So he survived a different way. He buried the boy. He buried the grief. He buried God. And for over 2 decades it worked. Until Sunday came around again. His name was Marcus. Not the name people whisper now, not the name that makes people go quiet in rooms. His real name. The one his mother used when she called him for dinner. The one his father wrote inside every Bible he gave him. Marcus. He was 12. Small for his age, actually. Skinny kid with a gap between his front teeth and a habit of humming church songs under his breath without realizing he was doing it. His parents were the kind of Christians who actually believed it. Not performatively. Not for show. His mother sang during dishes. His father prayed before everything, before meals, before drives, before sleep. They were the type of family that made faith look easy. Natural. They weren't rich. They weren't struggling either. Somewhere comfortable in between. His father worked long hours at a logistics company. His mother taught at a primary school 3 streets from their house. Sundays were sacred. Not negotiable. Every Sunday without exception the 3 of them dressed, walked to their church on Clement Street, and sat in the 4th pew from the front on the left side. Always the same spot. His mother said it was because the light came through the window there in a way that felt like something. Marcus thought she was being dramatic. But he sat there every week anyway. Because that's what you do when you're 12 and your parents love you and the world still makes sense. He can't tell you what the sermon was about that last Sunday. He genuinely doesn't remember. What he remembers is the sound. They were heading home. His father was in a good mood, laughing about something, his hand on his mother's shoulder, the 3 of them walking to the car parked half a block from the church. The street was quiet. That particular kind of Sunday morning quiet where everything feels slow and unhurried. Then the sound. Not a screech. People always say screech when they're describing it later. It wasn't a screech. It was a thud, a heavy, mechanical, catastrophic thud. And then glass, and then his mother's voice making a sound he had never heard come out of a human being before. A black Range Rover had run a red light going well over the legal speed limit. The driver was 3 times over the legal alcohol limit at 11 in the morning. He hit their car where it was parked, driver's side impact, the kind of collision that doesn't give you any time. No warning. Just before and then after. Marcus wasn't in the car. He'd been walking slightly ahead, kicking a stone down the pavement the way kids do. He turned around. And the rest of that moment he has never spoken out loud to anyone in his life. They were both alive when the ambulance came. Barely. His father had a severe head injury. His mother had internal bleeding they couldn't locate fast enough. Marcus was taken to the hospital by a stranger. A woman who happened to be passing and held his hand in the back of the ambulance and kept saying it's going to be okay in a voice that didn't believe itself. He prayed that entire night. Kneeling on the cold floor of a hospital waiting room, head down, hands so tightly clasped his knuckles went white. He prayed the way his father had taught him. Out loud, quietly, specifically. He asked God to please let them be okay. He said please more times than he could count. He made promises. The kinds of promises children make in crisis. I'll be good, I'll read my Bible every day, I'll never complain again, please just let them be okay. He prayed until his knees hurt. Then he prayed on the chair instead. His father died at 3:47 a.m. His mother lasted until the following afternoon. And when the doctor came out with that face, that particular face doctors wear when the news is the worst possible kind, something left Marcus. You could almost track the moment. Not dramatically. Not with tears even. He just went somewhere else. Behind his eyes. Somewhere the sound couldn't reach. He never prayed again. What happened afterward is almost worse than the accident itself in a way. Because at least the accident was an accident. What happened after was a choice. The driver, it came out slowly the way these things do when money is involved, was the son of a city council member. Connected family. Old money, older connections. The kind of connections that make police reports get lost and witnesses suddenly go quiet and lawyers appear from nowhere speaking in calm, measured tones about the tragedy of the situation and the limitations of what could be proven. The case never went to trial. The man served 30 days for a minor traffic violation. 30 days. For 2 lives. For one boy's entire world. Marcus was placed with an aunt he barely knew. She wasn't unkind. She just had 3 children of her own and not much room, physically or emotionally, for a traumatized 12-year-old who didn't speak much anymore. He wasn't mistreated. He was just unseen. Which, at that age in that state, is almost the same thing. The church visited twice. Then stopped. The community around his parents had meant well and moved on the way communities do. No one really checked on the boy who stopped praying. So the boy rebuilt himself alone. 23 years is a long time. Long enough to become unrecognizable. Not just to the people who knew you before. To yourself. The Marcus who had hummed church songs and asked polite questions and believed that God heard him ceased to exist somewhere around age 14. What replaced him didn't happen overnight. It was gradual. Deliberate. One decision at a time. By 16 he understood that the world operated on one currency. Not money exactly. Power. The ability to make people afraid of what you could do. Money was just how you maintained it. By 19 he had his first real operation. Small. Supply chain. The kind of thing nobody in the city paid attention to. But he was organized in a way that made older men take notice. He didn't flash anything. Didn't threaten unnecessarily. Just made it clear quietly that crossing him came with a cost they wouldn't enjoy. By 25 the city knew his name. Not his real name. The other one. By 35 there was not a single serious operation in that city that didn't have his fingerprints somewhere on it, or that hadn't been deliberately kept clear of him out of self-preservation. Politicians answered his calls. Judges who didn't were replaced by ones who would. He had systems. Networks. A reputation that did most of his work before he even entered a room. He lived in a penthouse on the east side. Clean lines, minimal furniture, a view of the whole city like he was meant to look down on it. Which in most practical senses he was. People who worked for him would tell you, if they trusted you enough, which was almost never, that he was fair. That's the word they used. Fair. Not kind. Not generous. Fair. If he said something, it happened. If he made an agreement, he kept it. If you crossed him, you knew what was coming and it came without cruelty, efficiently, proportionately, and without drama. He had a code. He could never really explain where it came from, which bothered him more than he admitted. He didn't touch children. That was absolute. Didn't matter who asked, didn't matter the circumstances. He'd walked away from deals over that line being crossed. Ended associations. Once, and this was the story people told quietly when they wanted to describe who he actually was. He had intervened personally when he found out a man in his network was running something that involved minors. The intervention was not gentle. The man didn't recover from it. And nobody in his circle ever brought anything like it to him again. He didn't explain that rule to anyone. He didn't need to. There were others like it. Small, inexplicable lines that didn't fit the image. He paid for a neighboring building's fire damage without being asked. He kept 3 of his late mother's friends financially comfortable, anonymously, every month without exception. Women who had known her from church and had nothing to do with his world now. He couldn't have told you why if you'd pressed him. He would have told you it was a business calculation. Cool. Difference. He would have been lying. He hadn't been inside a church since he was 12 years old. He didn't pray. He didn't discuss God, didn't mock people who believed, didn't engage with the topic in any direction. It was simply a closed room inside him. Wallpapered over. He had convinced himself there was nothing behind that door. Most days he almost believed it. Sunday morning. He was up early, he was almost always up early, old habit never fully shook it, standing at his floor-to-ceiling window with coffee going cold in his hand, looking at the city below waking up. He had a meeting that afternoon. A property acquisition that needed some quiet pressure applied in the right place. Nothing unusual. Just another Sunday. The Sunday thing. He was aware of it. He'd never said it out loud, but he was aware that Sundays sat differently on him than other days. A particular kind of weight. Like the day had a texture the others didn't. He'd trained himself to move through it without thinking about why. You get good at that over enough years. Moving through things without stopping to look at them. He decided to walk to the office instead of driving. He did that occasionally when he wanted to think. The city at 9 a.m. on a Sunday had a specific quality. Sparse, unhurried, the sound of church bells somewhere in the distance that he had trained himself not to register. He was on Clement Street when it happened. He noticed the woman first. Immigrant. You could tell from how she was dressed, the careful quality of it, the kind of clean and modest effort you see in people who don't have much but treat what they have with respect. She was holding her son's hand. The boy was 9, maybe 10, small, dark-eyed, wearing a pressed white shirt that was clearly his Sunday best. They were walking toward the small Pentecostal church at the end of the block, the one with the hand-painted sign and the music that sometimes drifted out to the street. He noticed them the way you notice things that don't require your attention. Peripherally. Without meaning to. Then the car. No warning. No screech. Not immediately. Just a blue sedan coming out of nowhere at a speed that did not belong on that street that hour that Sunday morning. Came up onto the pavement. Something had gone wrong with the steering, or the driver was impaired, or both, and it hit them. The impact was loud in a way that went through your chest. The woman took the full force of it. She went down immediately, hard, and did not move. The boy was thrown, caught the edge of it, hit the ground, rolled, lay still for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Marcus was already moving before the sound had finished. He didn't decide to move. This is important. He didn't assess the situation and determine action. He just moved, toward them, not away, which was not his instinct in any other context. His instincts had been trained away from exposure, toward exit, toward calculation. Not this time. He reached the boy first. The boy was conscious, breathing, a cut above his eyebrow bleeding freely the way head wounds do. He was making a sound, not crying exactly, more like the sound you make when your body is deciding whether you're seriously hurt or not. A confused animal sound. And then, something happened to Marcus that had not happened to him in 23 years. He looked at this child, bleeding, disoriented, alone on a pavement on a Sunday morning, and the room inside him that he had sealed and wallpapered over cracked. Not completely. Not all at once. The sound. Like something very old shifting behind a door that was never supposed to open again. He was 12 years old, standing in a hospital corridor. He was holding his own hands. He was praying to a God who wasn't answering. He blinked. He was on Clement Street. He was 35 years old. A crowd was beginning to gather. Someone was already on the phone, probably police or ambulance. He looked at the woman on the ground. She was breathing. He checked because he knew how to check, but badly. Too shallow. She needed intervention fast. He made the call himself. Spoke clearly. Gave the exact address. Told them what he was looking at in the clinical language of someone who has been around enough emergencies to communicate usefully in one. Then he sat on the pavement next to the boy and did not leave. He went to the hospital. That wasn't the plan. The plan, if you could call the impulse a plan, was to stay until the ambulance came, confirm they were in capable hands, and leave. That was logical. Cling. He had a meeting. He went to the hospital. He told himself it was to confirm the situation. Make sure there were no complications. He sat in the waiting area outside emergency in his expensive clothes, looking completely out of place, and did not move. An hour passed. Then he found out through a nurse he spoke to quietly with the kind of calm authority that makes people answer questions without asking why you're asking, that the woman's name was Amara. That she was from the DRC. That she had no family in the country. That the boy, her son Daniel, had a minor concussion and some lacerations but no serious structural damage. That Amara herself was in surgery. That there were complications. He sat back down. He doesn't know why. He still, if you asked him later if he were honest, couldn't fully explain why he stayed. Something had been jarred loose in his chest and he couldn't locate the source of it and couldn't settle the feeling enough to stand up and walk away. When they let him see the boy, they assumed he was family and he didn't correct the assumption. Daniel was sitting up in the hospital bed looking small and very serious. The cut above his eye had been cleaned and closed. He had that particular stillness that children get when they've been frightened badly and are now trying to process what happened without having the tools to process it. He looked at Marcus. And he said, "Thank you, mister." 3 words. That was all. Marcus had been thanked before. Many times. In many contexts. With money, with loyalty, with fear. He had received gratitude expressed in multiple languages and through many different currencies. This was different. This was a child who didn't know who he was, who had no reason to offer anything, who simply looked at the man who had sat with him on the pavement and said thank you with his whole face. Something in Marcus's chest moved. Not metaphorically. Something physically shifted. Some architecture he had spent 20 years constructing and fortifying, and he had to look away. He looked at the wall. He cleared his throat. He said something practical, something about the boy needing to rest. But the crack was there now. And cracks don't go back. He had his men make inquiries about the driver within the hour. It was reflex. Someone had hurt people on his watch. Whether they were his people or not was beside the point, and he needed information. That was just how he was built. The report came back faster than he expected. And what it contained stopped him mid-sentence. The driver was not a random incident. He was connected. Connected to a specific network of wealth and legal protection in this city that had kept its hands clean on paper for decades. A network that Marcus, over the years through his own work, had mapped. That he knew. The same network. He read the file twice. Then he set it down. Then he picked it up and read it a third time. The same network of men who had made sure his parents' death went unpunished. The same circle of connected money and legal architecture that had made 30 days an acceptable sentence for 2 lives and 1 shattered child. They were doing it again. Already, apparently, there were conversations happening. About the driver. About how this would be handled. About which version of events was most convenient. The same machine, oiled and functioning perfectly, preparing to make this disappear the way it had made everything else disappear. He set the file down. For a long time he sat very still. Because this was not just about justice anymore. This was not just about Amara and Daniel. This was the universe, or something, putting the same equation in front of him with one variable changed. Last time he had been powerless. A child with no resources and no voice and no one in his corner. He was not that child anymore. The insurance situation came up that evening. He already knew intuitively what the answer was going to be. These situations have a pattern. Immigrant woman, no documentation likely complete, no strong local network, no one to fight for her. The hospital was not a charity. The surgery was expensive. The treatment going forward was going to be more expensive. The administrator said what administrators say. They were very sorry. They needed to discuss payment options. They needed to know who was responsible for. I am. It came out of him before he'd decided to say it. The administrator blinked. Asked him to clarify. I'll cover everything. All of it. Whatever she needs. Do everything. He said it the way he said everything. Flatly, with the certainty of someone who has never had to wonder whether they could back up what they said. He left his contact details. He arranged a transfer that night. The hospital staff's behavior toward Amara's case changed by the next morning. Quietly, noticeably. He went back to the hospital. He told himself it was to follow up. Monitor the situation. Ensure his investment, because that's what he called it in his own head, an investment, was being properly managed. He sat with Daniel for 2 hours. The boy talked. Children do that when they feel safe, they just talk. Without agenda or curation. Daniel told him about their apartment, which was small but had a window that got sun in the afternoon. He told him about his school, about a teacher he liked and a boy he didn't. He told him that he and his mother went to church every Sunday without missing, even in bad weather, because his mother said Sunday was God's day and they respected that. He told Marcus that his mother was going to be okay. He said it simply with no dramatic emphasis. The way you state a fact. Marcus said, what makes you sure? Daniel looked at him like it was a strange question. As I prayed. God doesn't leave us. Marcus had no response to that. He looked at his hands. He took Daniel home with him that night. It was a practical decision. The boy couldn't stay at the hospital, there was no family to call, a hotel felt impersonal and unsupervised in a way that didn't sit right. He had space. He had staff. It was the logical solution. The penthouse, when Daniel walked into it, produced a silence that Marcus found almost amusing. The boy walked through it slowly, looking at things without touching, with the careful appreciation of someone who understood instinctively that this was not a place where you touch things without permission. Then he looked at Marcus and said, You live here alone? Yes. It's very quiet. Marcus looked at the apartment like he hadn't looked at it in years. It was very quiet. He designed it that way. I like quiet, he said. Daniel nodded politely in a way that suggested he didn't entirely believe this but was too well-mannered to argue. That night around 11 p.m. Marcus heard the boy crying. Not loudly, the contained, effortful crying of a child trying not to be heard. He stood outside the guest room door for a full minute without moving. He didn't know what to do with this. He was equipped to handle almost any situation the world could produce. A crying 9-year-old was not a situation he had contingency plans for. He went in anyway. He sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't say anything particularly useful. Nothing profound, nothing comforting in any practiced way. He said, "She's going to have the best doctors. I made sure." Daniel looked at him. "Are you scared of anything?" The question landed somewhere unexpected. Marcus said, "Go to sleep." But he stayed until the boy did. The next morning arrived gray and unhurried. Marcus was already awake, always was. He was standing in the kitchen at 6:30 with coffee when he heard movement from the guest room. He assumed it was Daniel getting up for the bathroom, or waking confused in an unfamiliar space. He waited for the sound of footsteps. Instead, silence. After a moment he walked toward the guest room. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open a few more inches, slowly without sound. Daniel was kneeling beside the bed. Head bowed. Hands together. Eyes closed. He was praying out loud but quietly, the way you pray when you're deeply in it, when you've forgotten there's anyone else in the world. Marcus couldn't hear all of it. He caught fragments. "Please let my mom wake up. I know you hear me. I know you're not going to leave us like that. Please God, I trust you. I trust you." Marcus stopped moving. Something happened to him in that doorway that is difficult to put into language. It was visceral. A physical sensation like being pulled backward through time. He was in that hospital waiting room. He was on his knees on a cold floor. He was 12 years old and his hands were clasped and the words coming out of him sounded exactly like that. "Please. I trust you. Please don't leave us." The difference, and this is the part that undid him, was the boy's face. Marcus's face at 12, praying in that hospital, had been terrified. Desperate. The prayer of someone negotiating, bargaining, performing faith, because to stop performing it was to accept that the outcome might be the one you couldn't survive. Daniel's face was different. Not peaceful in a naive way. The boy was clearly frightened. He was clearly in pain. You could hear it in his voice, in the slight tremble underneath the words. But underneath the fear was something else. Something that looked somehow like certainty. Like this boy actually believed in his bones, that the words were reaching something. That the silence on the other end was not emptiness but attention. Marcus had prayed like that once. Before he learned it didn't work. He stood in the doorway and the thought arrived unbidden and unwelcome. Or before you decided it didn't. He backed away from the door. Went back to the kitchen. Put his coffee down because his hand wasn't entirely steady and he needed a moment to not look at anything. 23 years he had kept that room sealed. One boy. 3 days. And the door was practically off its hinges. He called the hospital an hour later. No change overnight. Amara was still in intensive care but stable. The surgeon was cautiously positive. He relayed this to Daniel at breakfast with precision, keeping his voice even, keeping it clinical. Daniel listened carefully and then said, "She's going to be okay." "I know it." Marcus said nothing. But that evening, for the first time in a very long time, he did not fall asleep easily. He lay in the dark and he thought about a 12-year-old boy on a hospital floor and about a woman who had worked hard, who was trying, who had raised a son like that, and he thought about the system already moving to protect the wrong person again. And he made a decision. Not just to pay the bills. Not just to keep the boy safe. He was going to dismantle the network. Quietly, systematically, and completely. He had spent 2 decades building enough power to do it. He had never had enough of a reason to. Now he did. 72 hours after surgery, the doctors called for a meeting. Marcus was there. He had made himself a fixture at that hospital. Not intrusively, but with the presence of someone who made it clear through very little effort that he was invested in the outcome and that the outcome had better be handled with appropriate care. Nobody asked him directly who he was. Nobody wanted to. The surgeon was a careful man. 50s, experienced eyes. The kind of doctor who had learned to be honest about uncertainty because false hope was more damaging in the long run. He had been, when Marcus first arrived, measured in his optimism about Amara's recovery. The internal injuries had been complex. The The surgery had gone well, but the body's response was the unknown variable. He came out to the waiting area that morning with an expression Marcus couldn't immediately categorize. Not grief. Not the face he knew. Something between confusion and awe, if a surgeon could look like that. "I don't have a clean medical explanation for what's happening," he said. He said it like he was choosing each word deliberately. "She's responding at a rate that doesn't match what we were working with 48 hours ago. The inflammation has reduced significantly. Her vitals are stronger. We're seeing recovery that," he paused. "faster than we expected. Much faster." Marcus said, "What does that mean?" "It means we're moving her out of intensive care today. It means if this continues, and I have every reason right now to think it will, she could be having a conversation with her son within the week." Daniel, sitting next to Marcus, made a small sound. Not words. Just a sound of relief so complete it had no room for language. Marcus looked at the wall. The rational explanation was medicine. Good surgeons, good hospital, early intervention, the body's own resilience. He believed in those things. They were real and measurable, and he had paid for access to exactly that quality of care. And yet, he thought about Daniel in the doorway. Kneeling. That voice saying, "I trust you," with that face. The certainty that didn't look like denial or desperation. It looked like something he had no category for anymore. A miracle was an irrational explanation. He did not believe in miracles. He told himself that firmly on the way down in the elevator as Daniel hummed quietly beside him. Hummed, like the situation was already resolved in his mind, like the universe had simply confirmed what he'd already known. And yet, something that Marcus had kept sedated for over 2 decades was fully awake now. Moving around. Looking at things. He didn't give it a name. He wasn't ready for that. But it was there. Meanwhile, his men were moving quietly through the city. Information was being gathered. The network around the driver was becoming visible. Names, connections, the specific legal architecture being constructed to make this go away. Similar architecture to what had been built around a different accident 23 years ago. Similar names even. Some of the same family lines. He looked at the pattern and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not just anger. Something that felt almost like grief. For his parents, for his 12-year-old self, for every version of this story that ended the same way because the same people kept writing the endings. Not this time. 5 days after the accident, Amara opened her eyes. She was awake for only 20 minutes that first time. Disoriented, weak, blinking at the ceiling with the confusion of someone assembling the world from pieces. But she was awake. And when Daniel walked in and she saw him, clean, unharmed, safe, the sound she made had no translation. Marcus was in the hallway. He did not go in. He sat outside and listened to the muffled sound of a mother and her son finding each other on the other side of something terrible, and he thought about his own mother. He let himself do that for the first time in 23 years. Not the accident. Not the hospital. Before that. The particular way she laughed. The smell of the kitchen on Sunday mornings. The sound of his father's voice reading scripture with the lamp on, the rest of the house dark and quiet. He let himself miss them. And it hurt. Obviously. Of course it did. But it was a different kind of hurt than the sealed, airless pain he had been carrying. This had oxygen in it. This was the kind of hurt that belonged to love, which meant it was also proof of something. He was wiping his face when Daniel came out of the room. The boy looked at him. The boy had seen. He didn't pretend he hadn't. He sat down next to Marcus and they sat together in the corridor for a while without talking. Then Amara asked for him. He went in. She was propped up slightly, still obviously exhausted, still clearly in pain. But her eyes were sharp. Whatever had been knocked loose by the accident hadn't taken her mind with it. She looked at him the way mothers look at strangers who have been with their children. Assessing, grateful, needing to understand. She said, "Daniel told me what you did. He said it was nothing." He said it in the flat way he used when he didn't want to continue a conversation. She said, "No. It wasn't nothing." Quietly. With the kind of authority that has nothing to do with power and everything to do with truth. Then, "Thank you." He nodded. He started to say something practical. About the bills being handled, about her recovery, about the fact that she didn't need to worry about any of it right now. Daniel, from the corner, said, "God used you to save us." Simple. Matter of fact. The way the boy said everything. Marcus looked at him. Something crossed his face that he didn't manage to contain in time. Something raw. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and he meant it, every syllable in a way he hadn't planned and couldn't explain, "No." He looked at the boy. "God used you to save me." The words surprised him as he said them. But they were true. He didn't know what to do with the fact that they were true. He didn't know what it meant for everything he had built his life around for 23 years. He didn't know what it meant for the sealed room, for the boy on the floor, for all the prayers that he had decided were unanswered. Maybe they weren't unanswered. Maybe he just wasn't listening for the right kind of answer. He stood up. He told Amara to focus on getting well. He told Daniel to listen to the nurses and stop charming the entire ward staff into smuggling him extra dessert, which Daniel denied with a face that confirmed it completely. He walked out. He walked out into the corridor and the weight was different. Still there. He wasn't suddenly fixed. This wasn't the end of anything. He was still who he was. Still the man with the code and the penthouse and the city below him and the past behind him and the network of powerful men who had once taken everything from him and were now going to be held accountable. But the sealed room was open. And somewhere in it, dusty, unsteady on its feet but present, was a 12-year-old boy who had prayed and been told by something he couldn't prove yet but couldn't deny anymore that the silence had never been what he thought it was. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he took out his phone and called his most trusted man. "The file," he said. "I want everything. Every connection. Every name." He paused. "It's time." It came on a Thursday evening. He was at his desk, actual work, the kind that built the infrastructure of everything he did, when the knock came. His man Dorian. The one who had been with him since the early days. Reliable in the specific way that someone who has seen everything and remains loyal anyway is reliable. Dorian set the file on the desk without a word. It was thicker than he expected. He opened it. And he read. Not quickly. He never read important things quickly. He read the way someone reads when they're committing every word to a place they won't lose it. The driver's name was a man called Reve. Low level. A fixer, essentially, someone the network used when they needed something done badly and cleanly. He had a record that had been expunged twice. He had the kind of legal protection that only existed when someone with serious resources was maintaining it. He was in every practical sense owned. The ownership trail led up. It led through 3 shell companies. Through a property development firm. Through a law practice that Marcus had known about for years. Peripheral, useful, never worth disturbing because they hadn't crossed him directly. And then it led to a name. He read it once. He set the paper down. He read it again. Elias Vane. The name sat on the page like a stone. Elias Vane, 71 years old now, city elder, philanthropist, the kind of man who had buildings named after him and got standing ovations at charity dinners. The kind of man that the city had decided was untouchable not through fear but through respect. Through the careful performance of goodness over decades. Marcus knew this name. He knew it because it was in another file. A much older file. One he had built himself over years, painstakingly, as a private project that no one knew about. A reckoning he had been assembling without admitting to himself that he was assembling it. Elias Vane had been the city council member whose son had run that red light 23 years ago. Whose son had walked away from 2 deaths with 30 days. Whose son was now, according to a smaller note at the back of the new file, dead himself, of natural causes for years ago. But Elias Vane was alive. Still operating. Still with the same machine around him. Still with the same architectural talent for making inconvenient things disappear. The son was gone but the father's network had simply continued. And now 23 years later, a man from that same network had driven a car into a woman and her child on the same street on the same day, and the same machine was already running the same play. Marcus sat in his office for a long time. Then he closed the file. He thought about Daniel kneeling beside a bed at 6:30 in the morning, trusting in something invisible with both hands. He thought about Amara's eyes in that hospital room, clear and present and still here. He thought about what he had said in that corridor, "God used you to save me," and the fact that he had meant it even though he still didn't know fully what he meant by it. He thought about a 12-year-old boy on a cold floor who deserved justice and got silence instead. This was not silence. This was the opposite of silence. He picked up the phone. Called Dorian back in. Elias Vane, he said. Dorian knew the name. Of course he did. He'd been thorough. What do you want to do? Dorian asked. Marcus looked out at the city. The whole thing spread out below him. Everything he'd built. everything he'd become. Every decision he'd made from the moment he'd decided that power was the only language this world respected. Maybe it was. Maybe it still was. But power didn't have to only serve itself. Everything, Marcus said quietly. We dismantle everything. He paused. And we do it right. Outside the window the city hummed, indifferent and vast and full of secrets. One of them was about to stop being a secret. The man who had buried God was no longer buried. And somewhere in this city, Elias Vane, who had spent 71 years building a fortress of reputation and money and carefully maintained silence, didn't know yet that the boy from Clement Street had grown up. He knew now. End of part 1. Part 2 coming soon.